Today, we're installing an upgraded new generation Saab 9.5 gauge cluster into my 2003 Saab 9.3. This upgrade right here is one of the upgrades I've been most excited for in a very long time for my 9.3. And like I said, we're actually going to be retrofitting a gauge cluster out of a new generation Saab 9.5 into this car. So because the new generation Saab 9.5 is a completely different car, completely different chassis from the new Gen 9.3, we can't just take this and plug it in and be good to go. That's where this special piece right here comes in handy. This is a specific adapter and module called a gateway that is designed to allow this cluster to function as a normal cluster in this car. Many of you Saab enthusiasts are probably already familiar with ECID. ECID is a company based in Sweden who has developed some amazing products for these cars. I had the ECID 2 in my Turbo X back when I had it. Check that video out in the top corner. But he has come out with a recent product of the IPC 650 gateway, as it is called, which essentially, again, allows us to run a new generation Saab 9.5 gauge cluster in a 2003 to 2006 Saab 9.3. If you are interested in any of ECID's products, I'm going to link his website at the top of the description. Check him out. In the description, I'm also going to link a write-up on how this whole process works. It's extraordinarily detailed, way more detailed than I can explain in video, especially for the sake of brevity. So check that out, but this is what we're going to be referencing as we do this install. So essentially this harness has a few different connectors. We have one plug that goes into our new Gen 9.5 cluster. We then have a second adapter that goes into the female plug for the old MIU. The MIU is the gauge cluster in the NG 9.3. And then our third adapter is this one right here. This is actually meant for when we need to do Tech 2 work to the car. We do have to plug in the stock gauge cluster. So this is kind of an extra little harness that is left for when you do Tech 2 work, so that way you can plug in the stock gauge cluster. Installing this should be fairly straightforward. We do have to remove the ICM, the air vents, and the dashboard bezel right here to get access to removing the stock gauge cluster. Once we do that, we'll have to mount the new cluster. We're gonna have to trim the dashboard bezel a bit to fit the new cluster, as well as modify the cluster a bit. So a couple of disclaimers I wanna mention before we actually get into the install. Number one, this only works on 2003 to 2006 9.3s with the interior that my car has, essentially. If you read the write-up, you'll see why. There's a bunch of information on there about differences between the 03 to 06 cars and the 07 Plus that allows or prevents 07 Plus cars from being able to use this. Secondly is ordering. If you are interested in ordering one of these, he has a Google form that I guess I can also link in the description for you to fill out. You need to include your mileage, VIN, fuel tank size, a few other things that are programmed to the gateway module, because essentially I told ECID the exact mileage in this car. It's been sitting for a couple weeks, so that way he can program the mileage into this module, so that way when we put the new cluster in, the mileage is exactly the same and we won't have any issues with that. And the last little piece of information is the gauge cluster is of course bought separately. eBay is going to be the best place to find these, or from wrecked cars. There's a few different part numbers, and there's also two different displays. You can get the multicolor display, which I was lucky enough to be able to find, or the monochrome display. The difference between the two is the screen in the middle. The monochrome one is just one color, whereas the multicolor one, as you'll see, is, well, multicolor. That's one of the part numbers right there. I'll go ahead and kind of list them all on the screen right here, so that way you can do some searching of your own. But I think sourcing a cluster is the toughest part of this. There's definitely quite a few for sale, but I'm sure as this mod becomes more popular, those are going to slowly disappear. But without further ado, let's hop in the car, start removing some stuff so we can install this. Our first step is going to be removing two air vents. We have to remove this air vent as well as the air vent over here. I've shown how to do this in the past. Best way to do it is with some old credit cards. Just kind of file in here and pop the tabs out. On this vent, there's a few tabs. on the top and bottom that you kind of have to pop loose in order for it to slide out. And so with both of those removed, we can now pull out our ICM that's just held in by 2 bolts up here. One last step before we can remove the dashboard is this little control panel here. Actually, if you reach around back, you can squeeze, you'll see where the little clips are. You can just squeeze it that way. And lastly, there's 6 bolts for our dashboard, 2 here, 2 here, and then 2 on the left side. Actually, it looks like I missed one. There's a 3rd bolt on the very far left side, right on this inside edge. And well, at this point, we're ready to remove our instrument cluster. So there are 4 bolts for that. There's 2 on each side. Very easy to see and pretty accessible as well. Now, out comes our MIU. And we have one little connector on the back that we just need to unhook. There we go. Not too bad at all. Here's a quick comparison we have between the 2 clusters. You can see, generally speaking, their layout is just about identical. Tachometer on the left, speedometer in the middle with a little screen, and then your other gauges like turbo, fuel, and temperature on the right. In order to get this to fit and look the best, there are a few little things we need to do. First off, all of these little plastic ears, as they're called, need to be trimmed off. Secondly, this is optional, and I think I'm going to pass on doing it for now, but these 4 clear pieces either also need to be trimmed off or should be painted black. I don't think the look of these is going to bother me too much, so I think I'm going to leave it not painted for now and just focus on the ears. And the last little thing we need to do are these little tabs almost on either side need to be trimmed down. I like to pull up the masking tape there so that way I can visualize what it's going to look like when I'm done. And I can see we just have a hair bit more to do. Well, I would say that's looking pretty good. All of the ears have been trimmed off. Gotta say, really happy with how this turned out. And now I'm just doing the last little piece before I think we're ready to test fit and hook up everything. And that is trimming this side piece down. So I've trimmed it down about halfway. I'm gonna see if that's enough. Worst case, we can pull it back out and trim it some more. And there you can see what it looks like before trimming. So I'm going to do the same to this side, and then we can install it in the car. So there's our, oh, that's so satisfying. So I'm going to feed this back in here and then plug this one in to our factory MIU connector. Like that. And then lastly, our gateway unit, I think we're just going to tuck it back in there. It's probably going to be the best way to do it. I plugged everything back in, so let's see what happens. Oh yeah, check that out. We are now ready to mount our cluster to the car. Now, it does still have 2 mounting points on each side, similar to the original cluster. However, of course, the holes do not line up. So there's 2 options you can use for this. One is zip ties. I honestly tried this first thinking it would be easier and I wanted to avoid drilling holes in the car, but it's just really difficult based on where those holes are at and kind of the lack of, you know, ability to move your hands around in there. It's very difficult to get zip ties to work. So the other method, of course, is drilling. So what we're going to be doing is I think using these bottom two holes, because you can see they line up nicely on sort of this mounting bracket here. So I've marked a spot there on each side and need to drill 2 holes. And then coming up here, well, you can probably tell that our hole is actually right behind where those dots are at. So I'm going to drill a hole in the cluster there to hopefully match up with the factory screw location on the car. One nice little perk when you're doing this yourself to line it up is you can see that an NG95 cluster actually has a little mark on it in the middle, as well as the dashboard. So I have those lined up right in the middle. Makes it very easy to sort of center the cluster left to right. I've started with a very small drill bit after using a punch, just to be sure I have the factory hole there to my right for comparison, but just to be extra safe, I don't go too big, because if I go too big, I won't be able to use these factory bolts. 1/8 is the size I stopped at with the drill bits, and the hole was still a bit smaller, but that was perfect because as I sort of started to force the screw in there, it kind of created its own threads, and now it's in there perfectly. So I think we're ready to mount this thing. On the cluster side, I am going up 1 size bigger to 5/32, just because that'll allow me a little bit of wiggle room since the bolt actually isn't screwing into this part. Now, my main concern with this is it is very close to this sort of sidewall piece here. So I don't know how well the screw is gonna fit into that, but I guess we'll find out. So we are having issues with not only these lining up, but just these plastic tabs being in the way. So I'm just going to get the Dremel out and essentially shave this whole thing off. I test fitted the dash, and you're not going to see any of this anyways, but I should be able to make it look pretty clean. Got that trimmed down on both sides, so now it's going to hopefully fit like a glove. There we go. All 4 screws are in and mounted, and everything is centered perfectly. Pretty happy with that. Now we can move on to our last bit of trimming we need to do, and that is the dashboard bezel. So the factory 9.3 cluster is just a hair thinner, meaning that with this 9.5 cluster, it actually hits and just catches the edge of both the tachometer gauge and this gauge over here. So what that means is we do need to trim down this on both sides. After a good bit of trimming, I think we're at a pretty good spot on this side. You can see we've taken off a good bit, especially in this area. I plan on smoothing this out a bit before we do the final fitment, but here's it compared to the side that's untouched. So the way I'm doing this is kind of putting some masking tape on it, fitting it in the car, and then marking areas where we need to take away. So right in the general area of this line is where I need to start taking away a lot of material on this side. We're making some more progress. Our next step is going to be trimming down this bottom part of the bezel, because that's what's getting caught now. So I've kind of marked out, roughly, I think all this needs to be taken off plus a bit more. So I'm going to start by taking off this whole area here. And the final piece we will modify is our center air vent. These 3 clips right here are what need to be pushed down to remove it. This is an optional step, but after reading the guide, it makes sense. All 3 of those are trimmed down, which should make air vent removal much easier in the future. This has unsurprisingly been the most time-consuming part of the job so far. We trimmed this whole bottom piece off. I smoothed it out with a little bit of sanding, and we are just kind of struggling with these edges here. So I'm just taking it out, sanding down, putting it back in, sanding down some more until we eventually get the fitment right. So I'm at a point now where I have inserted most of the screws in here, and these 4 are actually all tightened down the whole way. And you can see our line on the top, it's just not quite perfect. So we do need to just take a little bit more off, and then we'll be ready for final fitment to get this to sit flush up here. It's just still rubbing on these corners a little bit. All right, let's feed our dashboard in, making sure that all of our electrical connectors are visible, fed through where they need to be, of course, especially the MIU connector that will need to feed near the air vent. Just because I'm stupid and might forget, and to make it easier to find in the future, I did just get a little piece of masking tape I'll wrap around the wires, just labeling it as the original MIU Tech 2 connector. And with that done, we'll just kind of tuck it back in there. I went ahead and also trimmed up the bottom 2 tabs on this because I wanted to test fit the air vent. It was still difficult to get out by only trimming the top 3, but now you can see it sits in there nice. It's still kind of clipped in, but as soon as I pull on it, it just pops right out. So I think that's going to be a perfect solution to that. But car is all back together, and I mean, this is so awesome. Ignore the check engine light. I have an issue I'm working on. We'll go through how all this works and how it's controlled in a minute, because of course we do have some customizability in this screen, which is super awesome. But I think we should take this thing for a drive. If you read through the guide that ESID provides, you'll see that on the NG95s, and if you're familiar with the NG95, there is a little stalk that comes off the steering column where you actually control the screen. Now, because this car doesn't have it, he had to cleverly kind of input it into the existing controls that we have. So if you own an NG93, you'll know there are certain buttons on here that you pretty much never use. I really only use the volume, the source, and the next button very rarely when I'm using the radio. The seek button is pretty useless, so what he has actually done is use the seek button. If you press up on the seek button, it changes between the 2 menus. So the trip fuel information menu, and then our vehicle information menu. And each of these menus has a few variety of options. Those are scrolled through by pressing the hang up button here. So I'm pressing on that, and you can see it's giving us a bunch of information about the car. Now, I don't have TPMS in my car, but if I can figure out how to make that work, that would be an awesome and huge little upgrade to have. My tires are actually at 35 PSI, but I'm not sure why it says 44. Maybe that's just like a default thing. But if I press the seek button again, we can go through here. Lots of different options: average vehicle speed, fuel economy, which is pretty cool. Fuel economy, of course, is also displayed up here. Then we have our estimated fuel range, and of course the one that will keep it on all the time, the altimeter style speedometer, which is just, oh, it's so cool. I absolutely love this. NG95s also had a little feature where they could read speed limit signs. Of course, we don't have that in here. If you had navigation would also come up through here. So if you're wondering how to reset these options, you can see it says press set/clear to set, and we don't have that option. Well, the bottom seek button actually serves as that reset button. So very, very well and smartly integrated. Huge shout out to ESID. They just did an amazing job with this product. But let's take the car for a drive. Oh, this is awesome. I mean, honestly, and I'm sorry I'm geeking out over this so much, but that altimeter speedometer alone makes it worth it. One issue I am having, and you can see it very faintly on the screen right now, it's much more noticeable at night. I'll put a picture on the screen, but you can see my temperature gauge, the bulb is actually burned out. So I made a post on the New Generation 9.5 Facebook group, was like, hey, what's up? What are, can these bulbs be replaced? Are they individually controlled? And they are special LEDs. However, no one gave me information on what exact link or part number I need for an LED. The only advice I got from people is, well, you should just buy a new cluster. And well, the multicolor clusters are very hard to come by. The monochrome ones do share the same bulbs, but at that point I'm harvesting a used bulb and that's an expensive used bulb just to put in this cluster. So if anyone has any advice or a link that they can share or a part number for a bulb that can go in there, that would be immensely helpful to me so I can get that replaced and, well, hopefully have all my lights working. Night panel still works. Oh, that's so cool. So cool. This is just so well integrated. A perfect example of an OEM Plus modification. If you guys enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up. Check out my merchandise in the description if you want to help support the channel as well. Big thank you to eSID again. All the useful information and links for this product as well as his actual eSID are linked down below. Super excited with how this turned out. I'll see y'all next time.